All right, welcome to another deep dive with us. This time, we're looking at something pretty mind-bending, I think. We've got these sources, some ancient Buddhist philosophy, particularly the Abhidharma tradition,
Mm.
and we're going to be looking at that in comparison with Ontic Structural Realism, or OSR, as I think it's easier to refer to it as.
Yeah, and what's so fascinating is the potential connections between these two seemingly disparate areas of thought. We're talking about ideas that have been around for millennia in the Buddhist tradition alongside a contemporary metaphysical theory. So to see how they might speak to each other and what insights that might hold for how we understand ourselves, well, that's really the goal of this deep dive.
Absolutely, and especially when you think about it, OSR, it comes out of this engagement with modern physics.
Hmm.
So we've got ancient Indian thought and then modern physics. Like, how did these two even end up in the same room?
It is kind of remarkable, right? I think it speaks to the fact that these questions about the nature of reality, the self, what exists, I mean, these are perennial questions that humans have been grappling with for a long time. And it's not surprising that different traditions, separated by time and geography, might still arrive at some surprisingly similar conclusions.
Yeah, okay, so let's start with the Buddhist side of things, specifically this idea of no self or an Atman. I think for many of us, the idea of not having a self, it just seems kind of strange, counterintuitive. So what's the big deal here? Like, what is it about the self that Buddhism is pushing back against?
So the core concern, as our sources emphasize, is that this everyday sense we have of, this feeling of being a solid, independent individual, that's actually at the root of a lot of our suffering. And the Buddhist critique isn't just about identifying with the wrong things, like possessions or status or whatever. It goes much deeper, like right to the very act of identifying itself. It's what they call appropriation or upadana. Think about like when you get a new gadget or something and you immediately feel like this is mine and you worry about losing it or damaging it.
Oh, yeah.
That strong sense of mine, that's a taste of the kind of clinging that the Buddhist idea is getting at. It's this clinging, this grasping onto a sense of me and mine that fuels attachment and aversion and ultimately just a lot of dissatisfaction.
So it's not just what we identify with, it's the act of identifying itself that is the problem.
Yeah, exactly. And to really get into the nuts and bolts of this, we need to look at the Abhidharma school. They were really meticulous about breaking down this whole notion of self. They wanted to demonstrate that there is no unchanging, permanent entity that we could point to and say, that's the I, that's the self.
So they were being really analytical about it.
Very much so, yeah. And to do that, they focused on these fundamental elements of reality called dharmas. Now, these aren't like physical objects. They're more like momentary flashes of experience, like a single sensation or a fleeting thought or a tiny bit of emotion. Those are dharmas. So they argued that what we perceive as lasting things, including ourselves, these are really just temporary collections of these dharmas, just constantly changing configurations.
So kind of like it has a conventional reality, right?
Yep.
It's like we agree that this is a table because it serves a purpose and it's useful to think of it that way. But ultimately, it's a collection of these dharmas, these little tiny building blocks.
Exactly. A table's not ultimately real in the same way that the individual dharmas are. It has a conventional reality, but not this deeper ultimate reality. It's like if you zoom in close enough, the table kind of dissolves into this constant flow of experience of arising and passing away.
I'm thinking about Hume and his bundle theory of the self. It seems very similar, like that analogy of the river. The water is constantly changing, but we still call it the same river.
Exactly. And the Abhidharma actually uses this analogy of a row of ants. So from far away, it looks like one continuous line. But get closer and you see it's all these individual ants, each one distinct and moving around. And the point is, our sense of a continuous self, that could be a similar kind of illusion. Like it's really just this rapid succession of moments of dharmas, but we perceive it as one solid thing.
Makes sense, yeah. And there's also this idea, our sources bring it up, of the self as something that would have to be unconstructed, like it would have to exist independently of our experiences. If the self depends even partly on things we can perceive or own or experience, then it's considered an illusion. That seems like a pretty high bar for what a real self would have to be.
Yeah, it is a high bar.
Hmm.
And this is where the distinction between the self, like this permanent entity, versus our everyday sense of self becomes really important. Buddhists aren't denying that we have a sense of self, that feeling of meanness. What they're saying is there's no corresponding, unchanging thing behind that feeling.
So it's like we feel like there's a me having these experiences,
Yeah,
but that feeling doesn't actually point to a stable, unchanging thing.
that's the gist of it, yeah. And then there's also this idea of witness consciousness that our sources talk about. It's this purely observational part of our experience, just pure awareness, like the screen that the movie of our experience is playing on. But the screen itself is neutral. It doesn't care what's being projected onto it.
Right. In some traditions like Advaita Vedanta, they actually see this witness consciousness as this ultimate reality, the one unchanging thing behind everything. But that's not quite where Buddhism goes with it, right?
Right. The Buddhist perspective, especially the Abhidharma, tends to see even the subjective experience, even the act of witnessing itself as momentary, just another dharma arising and passing away. You know, the self, as we usually think about it, like as this feeling of subjectivity that's always changing, or like there's this little mini me inside controlling everything. It doesn't really fit with these more abstract, invariant structural accounts.
So just because we're self-aware, because we can reflect on our experiences, that doesn't automatically mean there's this permanent self doing the reflecting.
Exactly, yeah. Consciousness is the space where experience happens, but the Buddhist argument is that we mistakenly identify with this whole collection of stuff, our bodies, our thoughts, our emotions, like it's all one big permanent me. And this identification is driven by all sorts of deep-seated habits, you know, cognitive and emotional patterns.
It's almost like we're constantly telling ourselves this story about who we are, and then we start to believe that story is some kind of ultimate truth.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And it's interesting, our sources also bring up Sartre and his distinction between the ego and the self as subject. So the ego is the self as an object, something you can think about, reflect on. But the self as subject is that more immediate experience of just being. So Sartre argued that unreflective experience, it might feel egoless, you know, without that explicit sense of I. But it's not necessarily selfless. There's still that first-person perspective, even if it's not fixated on a defined I.
Right, yeah. And then there's Zahavi and his minimal self, this pre-reflective sense of mindness. Like just that basic feeling that an experience is mine, that it's happening to me. It's so immediate and direct.
Right. He's saying that even this really fundamental sense of self, and it does seem really fundamental to having any experience at all, it doesn't necessarily require a full-blown, enduring self to exist. It's more about how experience is given to us.
Okay, so that's a good overview, I think, of the Buddhist no-self view. But now let's switch gears a bit and talk about this Ontic Structural Realism, this OSR. If you had to, like, explain it to someone at a party, what would you say it's all about?
So in a nutshell, OSR is this view in metaphysics that says, you know what? Structure and relationships, these are actually the most fundamental things in reality. Maybe even more fundamental than individual objects themselves.
More fundamental than objects. So how does that even work?
Okay, so the idea is that the identity of a thing, what makes it what it is, that's not something inherent in the object itself. It's determined by its place in a network of relationships. Imagine like a network of interconnected nodes. The identity of each node is defined by its connections to all the other nodes. And OSR is saying at the deepest level, reality is kind of like that. So a particle, for example, it's not defined by some set of internal properties that it just possesses on its own. It's defined by how it interacts with other particles, how it fits into this whole web of relationships.
So it's like flipping the script. Usually we think, okay, there's this object and it has these properties and then it interacts with other objects. But OSR is saying, no, the interactions are primary. The structure is primary. And the objects themselves are defined by where they fit in.
Yeah, exactly. And this really challenges these more traditional substance-based ontologies, you know, where you have individual things as the basic building blocks. In OSR, relationships aren't just something that happens between objects, they're what those objects are made of. Even our sources point out that some ancient Greek philosophers, they really resisted this kind of thinking. Because if a property depends on multiple things, then it doesn't really belong to just one thing, right? It gets all blurry and messy.
Which I guess is why it's so counterintuitive. Like, we like to think of ourselves and the world as made up of these separate, distinct things. This relational view just throws a wrench in that whole picture.
So what about different types of relations? Our sources talk about internal versus external relations. How does OSR think about that distinction? Yeah, that's a tricky one. There are a lot of different ways to think about it. One way is that an internal relation, it holds because of the very nature of the things being related. An external relation is more accidental. It could be otherwise. So like being a part of something, that could be an internal relation in some cases. And OSR isn't necessarily saying there are no intrinsic properties at all, but it's emphasizing that even those properties are often deeply intertwined with the relational structure. The focus is on how things connect and how those connections make them what they are.
Okay, yeah. And I know OSR is really relevant to the philosophy of science, especially when we're trying to make sense of things like quantum mechanics. I mean, that's where things get really weird and relational, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Quantum mechanics has all sorts of crazy phenomena, like quantum entanglement. This is where two particles, they can be linked in such a way that if you do something to one, the other one is instantly affected, even if they're miles apart. It's like they're somehow connected beyond space and time. And this really lends support to the OSR view. Like the behavior of these particles, it's fundamentally determined by their relationships and interactions, not by some independent set of properties that each one has on its own.
So the way we see things being interconnected at this really fundamental level, that's kind of what inspired this idea that reality itself is ultimately relational, at least according to OSR.
Exactly. And even within OSR, there's a debate about the nature of this structure itself. Like, is it mathematical? Is it based on the laws of physics? Is it something else entirely?
Right.
There's a lot of back and forth about that in contemporary metaphysics.
Okay, this is all fascinating stuff. But here's where things get really interesting, I think. On the one hand, we have this Buddhist view emphasizing impermanence, no fixed self, everything is in flux. And then we have this modern view, OSR, saying structure and relationships are fundamental. So what are the connections? Where do these two seemingly very different views start to overlap?
The parallels are pretty amazing when you start to dig in. So this core Buddhist idea of impermanence, that everything is constantly changing, that there are no lasting substances, that fits really well with OSR's downplaying of enduring independent objects. If everything is fundamentally defined by relationships and everything is always changing, then the idea of a fixed, independent self, it really starts to crumble.
Yeah, it's like the Abhidharma picture of reality, right? Like this constant flow of interconnected momentary dharmas. You could almost see that as a kind of very fine-grained dynamic structure, where the entities are really just temporary patterns in this constantly shifting web of relationships.
Exactly. And remember, the Abhidharma says that what we perceive as stable things, including ourselves, they're ultimately just conventionally real. They're composites of these momentary elements. And that resonates really strongly with an OSR perspective. OSR might say that something like the self, it's not a fundamental independent thing. It's more like an emergent pattern, maybe a relatively stable node within a larger network that's constantly in flux.
So the Buddhist rejection of a substantial self, it could actually find some support in OSR.
Yeah.
Because OSR says, hey, these substantial independent individuals, they might not be the primary building blocks of reality anyway.
Right. And then you have the Buddhist concept of emptiness or shunyata. It's a complex idea, but in essence, it's pointing to the lack of inherent existence in all phenomena. And that seems to resonate deeply with the OSR idea that things are defined by their relations, not by some inherent essence that they possess independently.
And our sources even bring up Francisco Varela, who drew these connections between emptiness and his idea of the self as merely virtual, like it emerges from these self-organizing systems. Though, as our source points out, a deeper understanding of emptiness might complicate that merely virtual label.
Right. Emptiness in Buddhism isn't about things not existing at all. It's more about understanding how things exist, like their nature is fundamentally interdependent and relational. So while Varela's connection is interesting, the Buddhist view might offer a more nuanced understanding of what it means for the self to lack this inherent independent existence.
Okay, and what about the Advaitin idea of ataisa, this superimposition of self and not self? Like, we mistakenly attribute the characteristics of the body and mind to this fixed inner self. Could we look at that through an OSR lens?
For sure. You could see adhyasa as this fundamental misreading of our inherently relational nature. Like we draw these artificial boundaries, create this false sense of separation, and we think there's this inner me that's separate from everything else. But the OSR view would say, no, you are those relationships. And the process of desuperimposition in Advaita, where you realize that you're not this limited self, but the underlying awareness itself, that might parallel this shift in perspective that OSR is suggesting, moving away from an object-centered view to a more relational view.
So both of these traditions, ancient and modern, they seem to be converging on this idea that the self, as we usually think of it, is this fixed, unchanging thing. It's just not the most accurate or fundamental way to see ourselves.
Yeah, that's a powerful point. And this leads to a really important question, I think, for anyone listening. What does all this relational metaphysics informed by both OSR and Buddhism, what does it mean for how we understand the human subject? How do we see ourselves in light of this?
Yeah, like if the self isn't this solid thing, but more like a temporary configuration of relationships, always changing, always dependent on these interactions, what happens to personal identity? How do we stay the same person over time if we're just this ever-shifting pattern of connections?
That's a big question that both of these traditions really force us to consider. From a Buddhist perspective, the continuity we experience in our lives, that's a kind of conventional truth. Like it's a stream of interconnected moments. But we mistakenly grasp onto it as one solid, enduring self. And OSR might say, well, maybe your identity lies in these relatively stable patterns of relationships that you embody, even though the specific content of those relationships, like your individual thoughts and feelings, your physical body even, all of that's changing. Like a river, the water's always flowing, but the riverbed, the structure of the flow, that stays relatively constant.
Okay, yeah. And what about agency? If there's no fixed me making decisions, how do we understand our ability to act, to choose?
Well, the Buddhist critique of ego and attachment, it suggests that our feeling of being this independent agent, a lot of times that comes from this mistaken belief in a fixed self. But a relational view, by showing us how interconnected everything is, it might shift how we see agency. It's less about an isolated individual acting upon a separate world, and more like this dynamic interplay within a larger system. You know, the Buddhist ideal of the bodhisattva is a good example of this. The bodhisattva recognizes their non-separation from others and acts to alleviate suffering. That kind of ethical framework arises from seeing this interconnected relational nature of reality. It's about understanding that our actions have consequences within this web of relations.
Yeah, it's less about an isolated actor making choices and more about this interconnected field of action. But I know our sources also point out some challenges to this no-self view, like the question of subjective experience, the what it's like to be something. That seems to imply that there's some kind of subject that's having that experience.
Yeah, that's a big one. Even if we accept that there's no self in this traditional, enduring sense, there's still this undeniable feeling of mindness to our experience. Like, these are my thoughts, my feelings. Peter Strawson had this idea of the thin subject to try to address this. Basically, the subject of the experience is just the experience itself. There's no separate, enduring entity that's having the experience. The experience just is.
And how does that line up with the Buddhist view? Because I thought they emphasized that consciousness itself is momentary.
Yeah, some Buddhist schools do hold that even the subject, the act of awareness itself, is momentary, arising and passing away like everything else. The sense of continuity, the feeling like there's this single stream of consciousness, that's seen as an emergent property, like a result of this rapid succession of momentary awarenesses. And again, the mistake is to identify with that flow as a fixed me.
So it's all about how we interpret that feeling of continuity,
Right.
right? Whether we see it as evidence of a fixed self or just as a kind of byproduct of how our minds work. And our sources also bring up other views of this self, like Daniel Dennett's idea of the narrative self, like our identity is basically the story we tell ourselves about our lives. How does a relational view fit with that?
Yeah, well, you could see the narrative self not as this thing inside of you, but as a pattern of relationships, both within you and with the world around you. The story we tell, it's shaped by those interactions, by our memories, our beliefs, our desires. But it also shapes how we interact with the world going forward. So the narrative self is relational. It's something we co-create with the world. Though, as our source notes, Strawson pushes back on the idea that everyone experiences themselves primarily in narrative form.
And then there's the inactive approach, which our sources say has a lot in common with Buddhism. Like the self emerges through our actions, through our interaction with the world. And Varela's idea of the self as this virtual construct also seems to fit in with this relational view.
Definitely. The inactive view says the self isn't something you're born with, it's something that develops through your engagement with the world, which fits with the Buddhist idea of dependent origination. Everything arises in dependence upon other things. And the virtual self idea, that also supports this view that the self isn't a fixed thing, but more like a functional pattern that emerges out of this complex system of interactions.
And the Abhidharma even has an explanation for that feeling we have of being the same person who did something in the past, this episodic sense of self. They say it's actually kind of an illusion, that it relies on memory and how we construct stories from those memories.
Right, so if our sense of self is built up through memory, and those memories are shaped by our relationships and interactions, then the self becomes even more clearly a product of those relations and less like some independent thing.
This is all leading to a really interesting question that our sources bring up. Can we reconcile this idea of a conventional self, like the way we function as society as individuals with rights and responsibilities? Can we reconcile that with this more radical no self or structural view?
Yeah.
I mean, the idea that persons might just be useful fictions is a pretty wild thought.
It is a challenging idea. So even if this ultimate self doesn't exist, we still have this practical reality of persons. We need that to navigate the social world, for ethics, for law. But the argument that some philosophers are making is that, okay, persons might be real in a conventional sense. They're useful. They help us organize our lives. But that doesn't mean they correspond to some ultimate reality. Maybe clinging too tightly to this idea of a separate person actually gets in the way of a deeper understanding of how interconnected everything is.
And lastly, even our sense of agency, of being the one who's doing things, even that gets called into question, right? The Buddhist view is that this feeling of agency, it might just come from not feeling like we're not in control. Like it's more of an absence of a feeling rather than a positive experience of some agent self.
Yeah, exactly. So our feeling of agency might not be because there's this little me inside pulling the levers.
Mm.
It could be an emergent property of this whole interplay between our intentions, our actions, and the feedback we get from the world, all of which are fundamentally relational.
This has been a really incredible deep dive.
Yeah.
Bringing together these ancient Buddhist ideas with this cutting-edge OSR. It's really amazing to see how they both converge on this idea of a fundamentally relational reality and how that challenges our usual way of thinking about the self.
It really highlights the power of looking at these big questions from multiple perspectives, and it leaves us, the listeners, with something really important to think about. If the self isn't this fixed, independent thing we usually think it is, but rather this dynamic web of relationships, what does that mean for how we experience the world, how we relate to others, how we understand who we are?
Yeah, what new possibilities open up when we start to see things in this more interconnected way? And what new ethical implications might there be? Lots to ponder. So we encourage everyone to keep thinking about these ideas, maybe do some more exploring into OSR, to Buddhist thought, and this whole fascinating debate about the nature of the self. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.